Welcome to this Euractiv debate on the EU agenda for global forests, getting the balance right. I'm Brian Maguire, and our event today is supported by Costerol, Fideol and FIFAC. Thanks to our supporters for this. You can follow the debate at hashtag EA Debates, and please tweet your comments using the hashtag. Our social media team will respond. And to ask questions, go to the chat section and use the Ask button. I will come to the questions a little bit later on as well. So please use your name and your organisation if you're willing to do that as well. We can direct the questions accordingly. The EU engagement in negotiating forest partnerships for the period 2022 to 2027 is expected to deliver on the European Green Deal priorities, as well as the EU's development cooperation objectives, including poverty alleviation and human rights. In its resolution to the European Green Deal, the European Parliament called for a European legal framework based on due diligence to ensure sustainable and deforestation-free supply. Cleaning up supply chains will remain a key priority for the EU, but industry argues that the process should build on existing actions and rely on a smart mix of different measures, which requires the establishment of solid partnerships and mutual understanding with producing countries. In just a few minutes, we'll be joined by the European Commissioner for Environment, Oceans and Fisheries, Virginijus Sinkevicius. He's currently across the street in Council with Agrifish. But now let's meet our panel to discuss these issues. We have with us today Samira Rafaela, who is still connecting, but she'll be with us in just a second. Samira is a member of the European Parliament, a member of the INTA Committee in the European Parliament. Carla Montesi is Director of the Green Deal Digital Agenda at the European Commission. Great to see you, Carla. And Gert van der Biel, he's a Senior Policy Advisor at Solidaridad Europe. And also joining us today is Marta Zuluaga-Zilberman. She's the Vice President of Government Relations Europe, Middle East and Africa at Cargill, and also Chair of the Environment and Sustainability Working Group at Fideol. Great to see you all with us today. Samira will join us in just a second. And in the meantime, I ask you just for your opening statements, short, 60 seconds, 2 minutes maximum. Carla, you want to kick off? You're on mute for the moment.
I am mute, so sorry.
I can hear you now, perfectly. There we go. We can hear you now. Off you go.
Many thanks. And allow me to say that, yes, of course, forest, it's an important issue for us. And what we want to propose is really to build on a foresting partnership. We really think that the forest is a global issue. Deforestation has many facets. Fighting deforestation requires a global and integrated response and take into account really local needs and the specificity. So the issue that we need to face, as you have just mentioned, is how we can meet global needs and reduce deforestation worldwide while supporting partner countries' development objective and respecting countries' sovereignty. Over to you.
Nice. Thank you. Excellent. Gert, over to you. 60 seconds or so.
Okay, thank you. Well, good afternoon. My name is Gert van der Bijl. I'm International Policy Advisor at Solidaridad. I first want to say that we absolutely welcome the European Commission's legislative proposals on deforestation. We have been active as Solidaridad in voluntary measures for decades. And we think that more is needed than only voluntary measures to really make the global agriculture sustainable. And I think two things are needed to be added. First is partnership agreements with the 7-8 most important producing countries, involving the main stakeholders there, like producers as well, to really make sure that the measures that European is taking to make its supply chains clean will also have impact beyond the supply chains. And these partnerships can also be a condition for trade agreement with these countries. Second point we want to stress is that it's important to make sure that smallholders are actually profiting from the measures and not excluded. In cocoa, coffee, rubber, but also in palm oil, smallholders produce an important part of the commodities worldwide. and they should be supported with technical support, access to finance, land titles, and also carbon credits to make sure that they are really stimulated to produce without deforestation. And if we combine that, legislative measures with partnership agreements and smallholders support, we can make sure that we both clean up our supply chains, but also actually reduce global deforestation. Thank you.
Marta, Samira's a little upside down. We'll go correct that in just a second. Marta, 60 seconds.
Right, I'll be more than 2 minutes, but I'll make sure that I won't go beyond, if I may. I think, no, but thank you very much for the invitation. And indeed, I mean, as Gert said, and Carla as well, I mean, we do acknowledge as industry that the loss of forest and natural habitat is a very serious issue and concern to us all. And of course, this is why we're also very supportive of the EU action and the strategy that is going to come up in order to combat deforestation. I think as an industry, I mean, our industry has been involved for more than a decade on actions to protect forests. And today there is a comprehensive set of measures, or let's say, or tools that are available, including monitoring, including traceability, also with new technologies such as satellite imagery or remote sensing, which are widely and voluntarily used by companies on the ground to really assess and identify, assess and manage the risk. Many of our companies as well in our sectors have taken commitments, and also they have internal policies and goals to end deforestation in their supply chains, and they're working on a daily basis really with farmers on the ground to try and impact that change and make better practices. But is this sufficient? I mean, certainly not. And this is exactly what we hear today. This is exactly what we need: more action than just the voluntary action that has been going on to date. And that is why we are supportive as well of a new legislation that is going to help scale up and really enhance and accelerate that sustainable transformation in agriculture commodity supply chains. I think maybe to the point that Gert mentioned earlier, I think factors that drive deforestation may be linked to agriculture commodities in many cases, but I think there are very complex socioeconomical reasons as well behind. And so finding a way of helping to address these underlying factors that are there is really essential. And this is why when looking at a new legislation or with the signing EU legislation, I mean, I think there should be a combination of demand side and also supply side measures, including voluntary actions and mandatory actions, and involving, of course, producer countries as well as EU actors in the market. This would help both reduce our impact as EU consumers on deforestation, but also ultimately help solve the problem of how we stop deforestation worldwide, which should be the end goal. Thank you.
Marta, thank you. We're still trying to get Samira back. Her iPad needs to flip around the other way and has to reconnect. In the meantime, Carla, just in broad terms, in terms of, let's put this in the context of the Green Deal and how this all moves forward as well, the smart mix that's necessary to clean up our supply chains, what does that look like in real terms?
We have just to listen. There will be a mix of intervention between the voluntary and the mandatory approach. Not focusing on the legislation because, as you know very well, legislation, not is EU diligence, is something that is under preparation. Our commissioner will say something in a moment, so I will let our colleagues from DG Environment to come more on this due diligence part. But it's clearly our action will be a mix between the due diligence as mandatory step and a mix of voluntary approach, and also a mix of support of a dialogue that we want to have with our partner countries. Allow me to say that we will propose two main axes of intervention. First, we really consider that we must raise the profile and the value of the forest. For example, question related to human rights linked to forest exploitation could be tackled as clearly as a part of our political dialogue between our partner countries and the European Union. So first, really raise the profile, deepen our dialogue with the partner countries. We Second, we really need to address forests in a holistic and integrated approach in order to cover this protection of the multifunctionalities of a forest. This will also, you mentioned the link with the Green Deal, this will enable us to deal with climate and the biodiversity perspective, but also to the sustainable exploitation of this forest, also in a context of bio and circular economy. Linked to the Green Deal, of course, I would say the second action, the second step of action that we would like to lead is clearly take into account the agriculture. You know that the European Union is traditionally the main donor in agriculture. We are spending around 1.2 billion euro per year in partner countries. Now we really need to promote sustainable value chain, and in particular in the agricultural sector that, as you know, would drives the bulk of deforestation. We are clearly said in our communication on 2019 that we said that in fact we take a strong commitment that any European Union support will not lead to deforestation. So this implies that also in all our work on the agriculture, we need to mainstreaming deforestation. And we are doing this into our methodology on value chain for development. So I stop here, but just here to demonstrate the link that we have and our holistic integrated approach, take into account also the impact that we'll have on climate change and on our work to support the agricultural sector.
Thank you. Do you have confidence that any voluntary action will produce fruit, or do you think it's necessary to regulate all the way down the supply chain here? Or is a smart mix a nice phrase but hides some other outcome?
Well, I think everyone now agrees that we need a smart mix, and I think everyone agrees we need this mix. But the question is, what is really smart? Well, we have been involved in voluntary measures for decades, starting with fair trade, coffee in the 80s, and work in a lot of commodities. And working on voluntary measures has had impact, but we need more. And only voluntary measures will not lead to the kind of impact that we need to really promote social development and reduce deforestation to the level that we need. I think it is important also to realize that there is an urgency. We have had many commitments from a large number of companies, and it's difficult to find a company that really met its 2020 zero deforestation commitment. So I think it is indeed necessary to combine voluntary measures with strict government legislation, but also we need to realize that we actually cannot do without government regulation, because only government or only company measures and only voluntary measures will not bring us where we need to be. And I would also hope that we can speed up the process and come up with concrete measures before the climate COP, so that also at the climate COP we can show what Europe and also the private sector of Europe together are going to do, and really make this part of a worldwide agreement to reduce deforestation and to reduce the emission of climate gases.
Okay. Thank you. Marta, who matters more in this equation? Is it the government side or is it the large purchaser? For example, if you, in any large organization, Coca-Cola, for example, decides that they want to change their procurement process to exclude anything which affects deforestation and clean up that supply chain, every element of their production process moves in line with that. Government can never really do that, and certainly can't do it in a hurry. So, for you, who matters more, the initiative of the private sector or the regulation from the public sector?
Thanks for the question. I think it comes a bit of both, right? So the answer is like there's not one silver bullet, there's not one unique policy from governments or actions from companies that would allow that. I mean, and that's why, again, we go back to the smart mix of measures. So what do we mean by that? I think First and foremost, I mean, we've been discussing and we've heard about due diligence, right? So mandatory due diligence, having that at the European Union level, and think, I mean, our industry is embracing that, and I think it can bring, I mean, go a long way to increase both the transparency, I think accountability for companies in better understanding the risk in the supply chains, and also have actions to mitigate those risks and report on that, right? And increasing the level playing field amongst all the companies in Europe and elsewhere. And I think then it comes, so that is a government intervention, I think, but it needs to go hand in hand with continue those partnerships and really looking again and what is the core of the problem. I mean, what are the underlying factors, like poverty or land tenure, capacity building, need for more financial incentives that really would promote that change at a scale, because a company can maybe leave, a region or a country or an area and not source from there, but that really won't help solve the problem at the end. So that's what we need to work together.
When we talk about due diligence, we have Samira back actually. Samira, can you hear us now?
Well, good
Okay,
afternoon.
let's unmute as well. There we go. Okay, you should be good now. Samira, can you hear us now? Good, yes, I can hear you.
Me now?
Yes,
right.
let's. You can make your opening remarks now. It'd be great to have you.
All right, thank you so much, and I apologize for the inconvenience, but this is the new world that we are living in and working in, and hopefully it will get a bit normal soon. So first of all, thank you to you and to Euractiv for inviting me to this conference. It's a very important topic that I definitely work on in the European Parliament. So deforestation is a very pressing issue worldwide, which the EU and the world need to address, I believe. The European Parliament is actively engaging with policy to contribute to reversing deforestation worldwide. And within the international trade, climate change and deforestation are becoming more important in our bilateral relations as well as multilateral efforts. For example, through the biodiversity strategy and green initiatives within the World Trade Organization. And for me, a key pillar of trade policy's contribution to deforestation efforts will be the upcoming mandatory due diligence legislation. So through effective due diligence legislation, responsibility for actions in the supply chain of logging can be monitored. And in addition, where violations occur, the EU has tools to address these issues. So every link in the chain from producer to consumer has a role to in chain responsibility in addressing violations. And that should be our common goal to address deforestation worldwide effectively. Additionally, EU free trade agreements have the potential to contribute to tackling deforestation. So with ambitious trade agreements, the EU can stimulate sustainable development, combat deforestation, and also make sure that countries respect the international standards. Trade policy is one of the EU's most powerful tools, I believe, to make sure that our international partners respect the standards on sustainability, on climate, and this, of course, needs to go hand in hand with enforcement of the agreed upon standards. So there is not one answer to tackling deforestation. It's a mix of policy as well as companies and citizens who want to contribute to tackling climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. Samira, I want to stay with you just now because I know you have to leave at about 5:30. So let's talk about the due diligence element and how the Parliament may see this as well. We've had various forms of greenwashing at different stages. So how do we avoid a kind of greenwashing in the system when it comes to deforestation as well? How can the regulation, how can the due diligence process be toughened up to make sure that there's sufficient transparency there, that the speed of action is robust enough as well? From your perspective, from Parliament's perspective, how do you envisage this happening?
Well, I believe that's why the aspect of mandatory is very important. So first of all, we need to work with mandatory due diligence, because otherwise I think it's very hard to enforce. So if you want to enforce, you need to make sure that you can tell the international partners to respect the international standards. And I think it's very important also to work with companies very well. And when we speak about due diligence, you need to make sure that we talk about the whole supply chain, because otherwise it will be very hard to tackle the problem as a whole. So that would be my main important thing. You need to make it mandatory, otherwise you cannot enforce it, and you need to make sure that the standards and the criteria are very clear, so that there is no so this is not unclear. So it's very clear where we go to and what we can enforce.
In terms of the Mercosur agreement as well, is this robust enough? Do we have the right instruments there? Should it be tougher when it comes to deforestation? Samira?
Well, it is a very, yes, it's a very worrisome element, of course, that I think is there when it comes to the Mercosur agreement. I do believe that we need to find a way forward to go through with Mercosur, because I do think it can set an example of how we can use trade agreements to make sure that it works for the climate, and that it respects sustainability. But I do think that things need to be better and more. So we need more strength when it comes to the trade and sustainability chapters in the Mercosur agreement. And this is exactly an example of where we can make these standards and these criteria very clear. And that we also need to work at the same time on a clear toolbox of enforcement mechanisms. So I think Mercosur is a really good example of why mandatory due diligence is necessary, but also why we still need to work here in the EU on an assertive toolbox so that we can enforce such standards.
Thank you. Marta, greenwashing and due diligence as well. How do we make this system, the process, sufficiently transparent so that we can avoid the risk of greenwashing? Marta?
No, I think, on that question, I would agree totally with Samira. I think it's more a matter of how to make it a balance, a balanced system, right? That is clear, that where we're working with agreed guidelines and agreed definitions at international level, that we're looking into not reinventing the wheel, but rather what is already there that we can build on, for instance, OECD guidelines or other, and really make sure that it is applied to every single operator in the supply chain, so that we are all clear again about what are the rules, the roles, and the responsibilities of each other, and then we can all work in collaboration.
Thank you. The rules and responsibilities soundbite so far. Gert, you talk about the small suppliers in this chain as well, and it's easy to overlook their voice because they may be disparate and the volume is not so loud. But so how can the rights of small producers be protected, and how can they be incentivized to play a stronger role in protecting our planet from deforestation?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to realize that the role of small producers in a lot of supply chains where deforestation is an issue is large. In cocoa, coffee, or rubber, around 80% of all production comes from smallholders. In palm oil, around 40%. So making sure that measures are inclusive is not only an issue of social equity, but also about being effective. If we really want to reduce deforestation, we should engage smallholders and we should address what is the root cause behind it, which is often poverty. And that also means that measures reducing deforestation should also be integrated in due diligence measures. And that it's also about who has the power and what level of payments are there. And there is a role both for companies and governments there. If we do not really address the income situation in cocoa, in coffee, or in palm oil, we will not be effective in reducing deforestation. So it's not only about saying to farmers, thou shalt not deforest, it's also about working with them on improvement of the income situation, and that's certainly the case for smallholders.
How do you achieve that without some form of subsidy? Because the market is not going to bear the cost of increased cocoa price, for example, especially in a difficult season. How can that market be adapted to ensure that there's compliance with a no deforestation approach? Gert?
Well, that will require market interventions, and in cocoa there are discussions about a living income differential, and there is a role both for the private sector, for the European government, and for local governments together to ensure that prices are being paid at such a level that farmers can earn an income, and only markets will not solve that. That will require a good cooperation between companies, governments, but also with civil society organizations and NGOs like Solidaridad and many others that are working in cocoa, but also with smallholders in palm oil, for instance. And what we see also in palm oil in countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, that it is possible to combine economic progress, reducing greenhouse gas emissions by less deforestation, and a future for smallholders. So it is possible, but that does require good cooperation and intervention and working with smallholders on the ground.
Thank you. Commissioner is just connecting at the moment. Samir, just the last question before you run off. So you've heard...
Last point, because
yes,
I
go ahead.
Unfortunately need to leave. So on that, so just to add, I think that we should also not underestimate the movement of consumers that are every day demanding more when it comes to these kind of standards. So the companies will also face a movement of consumers that are asking for transparency, that are asking for transparency when it comes to how products are being made and whether that was with respect for labor conditions, for example. And I also don't think that we should underestimate a movement that exists of companies that is already working hard themselves on this and on due diligence. So I expect also that it will be influenced throughout the years by movement of consumers and companies already trying to do their best to improve these kind of standards.
MEP, thank you so much for joining us. And now we switch over to Commissioner Virginijus Sinkevicius, who's been liberated by council and has joined us. Good to see you again, sir. Okay, I can't just check your microphone's on there. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we're good. Perfect.
Okay.
Floor's yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good to see you.
There you go. The floor's all yours, sir.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Of course, thank you for this invitation. And speaking about the topic, you know, expectations are very high when it comes to deforestation. It's high on the political agenda. It's very high on the Commission's agenda. It's an important matter for EU companies, NGOs, and of course citizens. And it's a key topic for everyone on the ground in the producing countries. And that's why we are so determined. It's one of those files where everything comes together: climate and biodiversity, social stability and security, human rights, health, and livelihoods. And that is really important when one considers that there are about 1.6 billion people around the globe whose livelihood depend on forests. For all these reasons, tackling deforestation is an important element in European Green Deal. And of course, we know now the issue is even more pressing in the aftermath of COVID-19. And what we have learned about the cause of pandemics, there is good scientific evidence to show that clearing forests and converting them to cropland increases the likelihood of new diseases emerging as a result of the multiplying contacts between humans and wildlife. It would be wonderful if we had an easy answer, but deforestation and forest degradation are very complex. We can have overall objectives like protecting existing forests, especially primary forests, and significantly increasing sustainable biodiverse forest cover worldwide, but the solutions need to be specific, not only to each country, but to each region as well. Of course, we are not starting from a scratch. The EU has a strong track record here, especially when it comes to supporting partner countries with their forest-related objectives. Between 2014 and 2020, the EU invested more than 650 million euros to support forest-related programs in partner countries. Under our action plan for forest law enforcement, governance, and trade, we have worked with over 20 countries, strengthening legality across the forest sector, putting in place sectoral reforms, and building capacity in the private sector. To give you a bit of history, the EU has been using soft and regulatory approaches to deal with deforestation and forest degradation for nearly 2 decades now, since its first action plan back in 2003. There are 2 central elements to our approach. We have the EU timber regulation, which prohibits the placing of illegal timber on the internal market and requires EU operators to exercise due diligence. And we have the FLEGT regulation, which sets up a licensing scheme for timber imports and voluntary partnership agreements between the EU and timber producing countries. So in the past, the main focus was on illegal logging and the associated trade. But those activities are no longer the main drivers of deforestation. Almost 80% of global deforestation is now linked to agriculture and the rising demand for food, feed, and other commodities. As a major economy and a major consumer of those commodities, the EU recognizes its responsibility. We want to be sure that, for instance, the soy, palm oil, cattle, and wood sold on the EU market are not contributing to deforestation in producer countries. We must and want to be part of the solution. So our goal is to contribute to halting deforestation and forest degradation and promoting supply chains that are sustainable and deforestation-free. Of course, major question here, what this will mean in practice on the ground. And as you know, we are working on a legislative proposal. We are building on past experiences and the lessons learned from existing legislation. We are also conducting a study on the role and impact of private certification schemes and the contributions they could make to additional measures. Part of that process is an evaluation of the effectiveness of existing legislation, a fitness check of both the EU timber regulation and the FLEGT regulation with its voluntary partnership agreements. For the EU timber regulation, a mixed picture is emerging. It has been an incentive for operators to focus on keeping their supply chains clean, but the structure and the wording of the legislation has made it difficult to use in practice. So competent authorities have found it hard to prove due diligence compliance failures in courts of law. In that area, there is definitely room for improvement. Under the FLEGT regulation, the voluntary partnership agreements, the so-called VPAs, have clearly proved their use in improving stakeholder participation, better forest governance, and regulatory reforms in some partner countries, but their actual impact on illegal logging and associated trade has been more limited. So we haven't found much evidence that these agreements have helped reduce illegal logging or the consumption of illegally harvested wood here in Europe. A lot of the problem is simply one of scale. The first VPA was concluded with Ghana more than a decade ago, but today when we have 15 different VPAs at various stages of completion, there is only one operating licensing system in place in Indonesia. That means that despite our best efforts, these agreements cover only a very small part of the overall volume of trade, so the total effect on illegal timber is therefore extremely limited. So these conclusions, together with the feedback from extensive public consultations, input from the European Parliament, and studies we have carried out, are quite clear. The current system of due diligence needs to be improved and enhanced, but that alone will not be enough. Any new legislation will need to be complemented by alternative support mechanisms, which help partner countries comply with the requirements. So these mechanisms need to be tailored to specific needs and the specific interests of each partner country, and they should retain the elements that have proved effective, while others, like licensing in a trade agreement, should be abandoned. And better information will also be key. And with that in mind, we are also creating an EU observatory. It will facilitate information exchange on global deforestation, combining trade data with Earth observation. So this leads to a question, where are we now? So how do things stand today? At the moment, we are finalizing the impact assessment. That means weighing up the options that will increase transparency in supply chains, minimize the risk and that products associated with deforestation and forest degradation end up on the EU market. We need to be certain that all options comply with our obligations under the World Trade Organization rules, and that there is no discrimination towards certain commodities. We started with a long list of 20 options. Now we are down to a few ones, such as improved due diligence requirements, country benchmarking, mandatory public certification, mandatory labeling, or a deforestation-free requirement. And we also have a preliminary list of products. The main criteria for choosing them is the overall impacts of production and harvesting on forests and their level of consumption in the EU. So that list includes, for now, palm oil, cattle, soy, wood, cacao, and coffee. And as I noted at the outset, we are talking about a global phenomenon. If the EU acts alone, the overall picture will change very little. We need to work with producer and consumer countries, but it's also vital to engage with business and industry. They are best placed to identify the pressure points, and they are the ones who need to take consistent action for best results. And of course, we continue to engage with partners, including in the context of our trade policy, both bilaterally and in multilateral forums. As part of this broad process of engagement, we have set up multi-stakeholder platform on deforestation. All the major players are involved, and they bring enormous expertise. We have representatives from consumer and producer countries, civil society organizations, and businesses, industry association, and it's a platform for exchange, for building alliances, and of course, for sharing the sort of commitments that will help us hold deforestation. We are learning a lot, and of course, it is helping us get the messages across. So, finalizing, we have come a long way since the first Commission proposal in its 2019 communication. Under the Green Deal, we are advancing steadily, and we are advancing with care. We have no choice but, of course, to get it right. And for that to happen, we need to listen to the views from all sides. So, of course, I'm very much looking forward for this exchange. But let me finish here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Commissioner, thanks so much, and thanks so much for taking the time to reorganise your schedule to meet with us after the change of plans at the Council today. Great overview from the Commissioner there, and let's follow up on some of the points that the Commissioner's just raised. Gert, the level of consumption in the EU was a focal point which the Commissioner mentioned as well, so that seems like a good starting point. High level consumption goods, we should be able to have a reasonable impact by focusing in those areas, but how do we build the bridges with the producers and the producer countries, as the Commissioner said as well? Gert?
Well, I'm glad that the Commissioner also highlighted some of the first conclusions of the impact analysis. And one of the things that did strike me was, let's say, the concerns about the way voluntary partnership agreements worked so far. And I think it's important to realize that if they have not been effective so far, we should shape them in a different way, but not say that partnership agreements as such will not work, because there is no alternative. I think the only way we can reach impact is to work with producers on the ground and to work with local governments to make sure that what we do here in Europe in cleaning our supply chain is really reaching effect on the ground. And there is no alternative than to work with governments and to work with producers. And in some regions, we do see impact of these cooperations. In Southeast Asia, in Malaysia and Indonesia, over the last 5-6 years, deforestation has gone down by something like 70%. Because of a good cooperation between the private sector, the governments, and also NGOs working on the ground. So it is possible, but that does require a well-managed cooperation, and that can be done because in most countries,
I want to bring Martin
it is
just a
possible.
second.
Yeah.
I want to bring just to conclude on this particular point. What does well-managed cooperation look like? What does, beyond the policy statements, beyond the stakeholder briefings, when it gets down to it, you talk about 70% reduction in deforestation. That's huge. What makes that work?
No, thanks for the question, but maybe I'm going to be back on what Gert was mentioning, because I think it's a very important point on the voluntary partnership agreements. I think without forest and producer partnerships, we won't be able to succeed. And I think indeed, if those partnerships were helpful to address some major challenges because they were basically building on the underlying problems, that's really what we should be building on, basically. But then to come back to your point, yes, indeed, I think building bridges with producers and on the economic factors, etc., can take places in many different ways, right? And so there are initiatives on the ground by individual companies that are happening nowadays, but not every company maybe has the possibility to do so. And so I think there are also partnerships that include individual companies with farmers, with civil society, with governments, where they are really co-creating like good agriculture practices, and they putting those in place, maybe at an individual farm level, but also in bigger landscapes and jurisdictions. And I think that's what we really need to aim to, right? It's more like, how are we going to be able to build on what's already happening in origin that maybe then is promoted via means of a verification or a certification, let's say, a program to see how can we incorporate this into maybe what is coming through EU legislation, so that we don't lose that power of, the advances that have been made on the economic level. And I think building then as well on a point earlier mentioned, it's going to be probably very important as well to look into how do we give those financial incentives to farmers and farmers communities, right? What are those innovative ways in which we can reward changing of practices of the ground from farmers in the aim to get more sustainable supply chains?
Carla, if deforestation was a country, it would be the third largest polluter, emitter of CO2 in the world after the United States and China. How do we fund, from the Green Deal approach, how do we fund this kind of transformation which is necessary? How do we, what are the budget lines in the Green Deal to help achieve transformation outside of Europe, working with producer countries and other partners?
Allow me to say that clearly the work that we are engaged to do, it's country by country. I think that we can see some problematic by key sector. If we take about cocoa, it's clear that we are clearly working with Ghana, with Ivory Coast, with Cameroon, the biggest producer of cocoa. But looking now into the matter, the clear idea is that we work in the next 7 years with all the big countries or regions that have an impact on deforestation. And the instrument that the Commissioner just mentioned, of course, will be this mix of a policy instrument that we will have. And one will be clearly this EU forest partnership. So the idea is clearly working in agreement with partner countries. I think that I absolutely agree with all the other speakers in saying dialogue with the countries, dialogue with the public sector in the countries, but also the producer, but also the civil society will be an important element, but dialogue have to be there. So with this forest partnership, we will try to put in place a common vision for forest, a common vision to tackle deforestation, and we will have to build, take into account the different perspective coming from the impact on climate change, on biodiversity, on growth and the jobs, on the impact of the producer that we just mentioning, and also on the right of local communities, because we know also that the local communities have rights and are essential also to build and to fight against deforestation. So it will be really a mix of measures and a strong dialogue that will take place country by country and region by region.
Let's take one country, not to isolate Brazil, but dialogue doesn't seem to be working with President Bolsonaro. His official policy seems to be with the forest, burn, baby, burn, because nothing which is said was working. His voter base supports deforestation. The smallholders in Brazil are encouraged to continue to destroy the forest, largely by burning, and nothing seems to be changing there. How do we work with belligerent countries? I'm not asking you, I know you can't speak directly about Brazil in this regard necessarily, but how do we work with belligerent countries who simply won't listen? Carla?
About Brazil, that's why we are moving with this mix of instruments between the mandatory and the non-mandatory. Of course, now the mandatory legislation will be there, so there will be a clearly impact on imports from commodities that will not respect these rules. But it's not just the mandatory approach; it's also the dialogue and the accompanying measures that we would like to put in place to facilitate the role of these partner countries that will work on this. So clearly, the mandate, the legislative, the due diligence will be there. The mandatory approach will be there. So commodities that will not be in conformities with the new legislation will not be possible to import in Europe, but this will be the case for some countries, and of course with many other countries, we suppose and we hope with all the accompanying measures that we want to put in place with the producer, with the governance, with the certification process, with the monitoring process that we will put in place. We hope to be able to support the countries to face and to be in conformity with the new legislation, so without avoiding a big impact on imports.
Thank you. To our audience, please send in your questions. We're going to turn your questions over to the panel in just a few minutes. Let's go back to Marta on this as well. You work for Cargill, which is a massive company with a huge global footprint as well. In terms of innovation, what role does innovation play in your strategic view of how to manage deforestation?
Mute. No, thank you very much for the question. And I think, the role of innovation is indeed critical. And as I was mentioning earlier, is really how we build on innovations in the area of geospatial or satellite monitoring to help verify really land use. So that's really what we're concentrating on. And I think maybe, since you mentioned Cargill, so yes, as Cargill, we're putting as well our innovative hats, on to see, okay, how can we find new solutions, not just from the company, but from the wider community. So in 2020, we funded we launched a land innovation fund, which is really helping. We put, I think, something around the 30 million mark, which is administered by another company, Chemonics International, and is really looking into what are those kind of projects that can come in place. Both working with governments, but at farmers level, and also in terms of other partners in the supply chain to really come with innovative solutions. And when I say that, I mean it's really more from really programs that are going to help farmers adopt more sustainable practices, helping with the know-how on new technologies, or for instance, with local governments really helping on finding new fiscal measures that they can apply, and not only with, again, at national level, but it's really very important, as I think we've heard earlier, how we work at different levels of jurisdictions, right? How we work with the regional level and with the local level as well in finding these solutions.
Thank you. How do you see innovation in this pitch as well? Is it something it's on your policy statement, or is it something which is just wishful thinking when it comes to dealing with small producers?
No, it's definitely not wishful thinking, and I think it also gives possibilities in countries like Brazil to find solutions. Solidaridad is working in Brazil with farmers in livestock and soy. also with support of the Land Innovation Fund that Marta mentioned, but working with farmers to create business models for farmers to expand their production without deforesting. And that does require indeed innovative approaches, integration of soy farming with livestock farming, using new technologies. And so there is a lot possible. And I think that can also help in a country like Brazil, because I think it's important to realize that it is difficult to work with the federal government in Brazil at the moment, but Brazil is huge. And there are a lot of farmers that really are eager to find solutions to work without deforestation, and the role for the private sector there will be larger possibly than in other countries, but a lot can be done. And it's not always necessary to work with the federal government. There are state governments in Brazil that are really eager to reduce deforestation in their state. So also in a country like Brazil, a lot can be done, but it does require cooperation and working together on the ground.
Yeah, just to follow on that, if you take Brazil, for example, these smallhold farmers, the income differential is really the point here, and it's a price point. So if innovation can help increase their margin at different ends of the supply chain as well, is that something that we need to support, that we need to look at? For example, digital technology. Carla's nodding. I'm going to come to Carla on this in just a second. So do you see evidence of this in your own work with these producers, that if you speed up the supply chain, if you make the certification process less burdensome, things like that, they help with the profit margin, and that incentivizes the small producers to get on board and to do the job properly?
Absolutely, and we see this in Brazil, where we in the Amazon area work with small farmers that combine production of cocoa and livestock, where more intensive production, so getting more production per hectare and thus requiring less expansion, can help farmers to increase their income without cutting down the forest. And in the end, much comes back to the question, how can you make sure that it pays more to let the forest standing than to cut down the forest? And that is about innovation, and that is indeed can also be supported by digital tools to improve production. And yeah,
do you think we need a global cap policy?
No, not a global cap policy, but what can help here is to make sure that the carbon markets that we are creating is not only profiting the large farmers, but can also help to reduce deforestation by smallholders. And that's not about massive subsidies. That is about building a system that pays for performance.
Excellent. Thank Carla. They gave you a green deal in your job description, and they thought that wasn't enough, so they added on digital as well. So how do you see this in terms of the innovation model and the capacity for digital to impact on the benefits for stopping deforestation?
I will answer to you, but allow me to support what Gert just said about Brazil, because you were mentioning Brazil's only mentioning, of course, the government approach, but very support what Gert said, that also in a country like Brazil, we can do a lot working with the small producer and the civil society that are there. So we need to continue to put our pressure and our work into this. Now, about in the innovation and the innovative efforts and the initiative, allow me to say that, of course, the digital will be a key element in the development of all this matter, but also all the system that we are putting in place for the monitoring of deforestation, and have a look how we are using, for example, the European Space Agency through Copernicus, just to ensure the monitoring of deforestation and all the supply chaining mapping effort to place of the production into the point of consumption. So clearly this all effort on the digital, all the effort in identifying the data, it's essential. Of course, after will come also on the objective to make this data useful for a specific policy purpose. But innovation will come also at the level of the governance, governance level in our partner countries. I think that there is a lot of innovative approach that we can put in place in working with the local authorities. Allow me once again to take the example of what we are doing with the cocoa sector. It's a deepened dialogue. It's a digitalization into this that it's coming on board, but it's also all the focus on research, research to identify other ways in producing the cocoa in a cocoa that could be sustainable. And we are putting a lot of efforts, for example, in research in the agricultural sector, looking to the agroecology, how a production that will move into an agroecology criteria can allow us and can allow the small producer to have a sustainable product that they can enter into the chain. So absolutely innovation and the innovative approach will continue to be key.
Thank you. I think eating less chocolate is not likely to be a popular policy approach. But Marta, over to you. You want to respond there?
You know, it's just building on that, because I think indeed, and that innovation is probably helping both. I think again is increasing transparency, right, of what companies are doing, how they're doing it, because I mean, thanks to technology, we're now able to really see exactly what is happening on the ground, exactly really get to levels where in the past we couldn't so far. Right, so that's on the one hand is that increase of transparency that would help as well in the implementation of the due diligence and traceability. And then on the other hand, innovation, I mean, again, coming back to those carbon markets that were mentioned, right? So how are we going to be supporting farmers to find those financial tools that can help them really accelerate progress, right? And offer them measures that will offer them concrete incentives for producing differently. So I think there's still probably a lot of work to be done in that area of green bonds, etc. But I think it's really an area to explore, because at the end of the day, if we're really going to move the needle, what we need is to find ways in which we're going to be incentivizing farmers to produce differently as well.
Thank you. Let's take some questions now. First one was from Stan, who said the Commissioner mentioned individual sectors. What can the cocoa sector expect when being singled out? I think we've covered some of that. Anybody else want to add any further remarks to that? No? Okay, another one from Andre Nassar. He asks, how do we deal with the fact that countries have different legislations regarding deforestation? I think Marta mentioned working in different jurisdictions earlier. Marta, you know, how do we work with the different legislations, jurisdictions when you're dealing with deforestation? Do we go with a big stick from Europe and say this is the way it's going to be if you're going to play in our market, or do we have to be more flexible?
Thank you for the question. No, I think there are different levels or layers maybe within that question. I think one of them is indeed what we see in Europe is probably different approaches also at country level maybe. I mean, just not within Europe, but also outside Europe. So it's really looking in how can we have that type of, well, EU or European, but also international approach. So how do we find also ways in which countries and governments can continue having this conversation on a government-to-government setting, and also including at international level? Because there is a need to agree exactly on as much as possible on having harmonized ways, right, in terms of defining, the definitions of deforestation or of forest conversion, etc. So finding an agreement at that level, I think it would go a long way to helping. And indeed, I mean, of course, then I think is what the Commission was also mentioning. This needs to be done in partnership with producing countries and also with other consuming governments. So at the end of the day, I think even opportunities like the COP26 and the Biodiversity Convention meeting, I think they are great opportunities as well for that international level discussion on the problem of forest protection.
Okay, Hert, on the same element, is the push element stronger or the pull element stronger, in the sense that, if you want to play in our market, which is huge for most suppliers, you need to come in on our terms. Is that sufficient incentive for people to get their act together when it comes to deforestation?
Well, in the long term, you will need business models for farmers that gives them a future and possibilities to increase production and income without deforesting. So that is, in the end, what needs to be the basis. Farmers need to have an income, and if they can't earn an income, they will find ways. So in the end, that's where it's all about. And then also coming back to Andre Nassar's question, yeah, it will be a combination of government measures, also locally, and stimulating measures from the supply chain. And a country like Brazil has a fairly well developed environmental policy. What needs to be done is to bring that together into a really working scheme of things that does stimulate farmers to expand without cutting down the forest, and that can be done.
Let me go to Carl on this, just to follow on something the Commissioner said. He said the previous legislation, it was very difficult to enforce. And from other experiences that we have with the Green Deal as well, how do we, just following off what Hert said, how do we get enforcement done properly? So if Brazil has good framework there, but it's not being applied rigorously, how do we in Europe enforce this process?
Brian, if you allow me, I would like just to say something on the previous comment that Marta and Gert were just working on this, because you were mentioning about our role at the international level, and allow me really to support what was said, that we need to continue to work at the international level about this legislation with other countries, because we must be aware that the European Union market will have a limited impact on stopping deforestation. So we really need to continue to work with all other major consumer countries, and to steer also the process, to steer the fact that also other consumer countries adopt mandatory measures to stop imported deforestation. I think we have worked into this, for example, in the context of the flagged action plan, and but really we need to continue to work with US, Japan, Australia, Korea, and also with China, because it will be really very, very important that we have, we say, a common approach into this subject at international level. So we will continue to work into this with also our partner countries, not just at the EU level. Now on your question, of course, we say everything that it's about the legislative process will require time to be implemented, and we will have to put all the efforts into this. I think that the Commissioner clearly mentioned our experience on the voluntary partnership agreement on the VPA. I know that, and also Gert, I think I mentioned this, that it will be very important to continue the work that was done. Of course, it was not enough. I think that we all agree that it was not enough, but we have succeeded in any case to improve in many countries the governance. And with the dialogue in many countries, we have succeeded to have a fast step, not everything that we were supposed to have. So any legislation will take time, and will take a lot of efforts from all the level, and we will need to be engaged into this. And this is the reason why we together with, once again, this mix of instrument, we would like to accompany this EU diligence legislation with a strategic partnership, putting in place some measures that will allow to facilitate the implementation of the new legislative process.
Carla, just on the international side as well, tomorrow morning actually I'm leading a program here on the capacity for United States, Europe and China to work together to speed up the climate change process as well. Do you see that the international partnerships, do we need everybody on board? Do we need COP26 to deliver here, or do we need strong strategic partners like United States and to some degree China as well to get this done more quickly? As you say, it takes time. Can these processes with key players speed up the process without a full international agreement? What do you think?
Of course, yes. You said, but we needed to start with the big players,
okay,
and to build on this.
Here's a question here from Julia Christian. I don't know how accurate this is, but I try to check it on maybe you're able to clarify. How does the European Commission explain that nearly none of the major producer countries are included in the list for forest partnerships? I assume it's the voluntary partnerships. Do you know if that's accurate?
Well, if it's coming from Julia, I guess it's accurate, knowing her. Well, what the Commission has said is that the one voluntary partnership agreement that has really been effective has been the one with Indonesia, and I think that is the case. And yeah, I think that does require really looking into the design of these partnerships and to see what we can learn from what went wrong and do it in a better way.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions here. Just let me check. And any direct payments? Somebody anonymous says, are direct payments to countries for nature protection rather than to the forestry sector not a more efficient approach? Marta, any opinion on that?
I think that's for Gert, maybe.
Gert? I'm trying to spread the responses here a little bit.
No, I think it can be a combination of the two. And what is crucial in the end is that both countries and farmers feel stimulated when they reduce deforestation. And then coming back to Brazil again, Brazil has shown in the past that it is definitely able to reduce deforestation in a dramatic way. What I think what went wrong is that Brazil in the past did not feel appreciated and did not really have the idea that the international community was rewarding them for what was being done. And I think that needs to be done different, both at government level and at farm level. And if that's through payment for nature or for carbon, yeah, for me, I think both can be possible.
Julia has responded. Thank you, Julia. She said she meant the forest partnerships, not the VPAs. Brazil, Indonesia, Ivory Coast and Paraguay are not included. Thank you for clarifying that. And anonymous, it could be a different anonymous, we don't know. How can the shift to a circular economy and growing demand for wood be combined with halting deforestation? Carla, square that circle. How do we reduce deforestation while demand is growing, with the circular economy thrown in for good measure?
I think we need to cope with both objectives, and deforestation will be there, and we need to continue to work into the circular economy, and that will be clear to reduce the waste, to reduce many other things. So it's clear that we need to have both objectives in our mind and focusing on both.
Thank you. Let's go to our concluding remarks. We're pretty close on time now. Gert, do you want to kick off with your soundbite to finish?
Well, what I want to say as final words is that I think Europe can play an important role in reducing deforestation, but that it is crucial that we combine legislation on deforestation to clean up our supply chain with partnerships with producing countries and invest in smallholder inclusion. And if we do that, we can both clean up our supply chain and play an important role in reducing global deforestation.
Excellent. Thank you. Carla, your soundbite.
I think that allow me to conclude that we all know what's needed to be done to stop deforestation and how to do it, and we really need to find a suitable and sustainable solution for our forests. I think we can succeed to do that, but really we need to join forces with all the key actors working on this, coming from the small agriculture to the industry and to the civil society to the government. So really joint forces and join the resources.
Thank you. Marta, last word.
Thank you. Thanks. So indeed, I mean, just wanted to say our sectors continue very engaged in this sustainability journey. That's the first thing. And I think the EU initiative against deforestation, including mandatory due diligence, should also take into consideration the existing engagements that are already there to transform supply chains and really work hand in hand with those to improve production practices. And I think maybe what we mentioned as well is that we need continuous dialogue at government to government level in different settings, whether it is bilateral or multilateral level. And put really focus as well on green diplomacy so that it can both work on the private sector side and on the, with the civil society and governments, that we can all work together to find a solution.
Rights, roles and responsibilities. Thank you to our panel, Samira, Carla, Gert and Marta. Also thank you to Commissioner Sinkevicius for taking the time to be with us today as well. And thanks to our team here, who you can't see. They're right with me, Evie, Simona, Malta, and to our sponsors, Costrol, Fidiol and FIFAC. Thank you to our audience for your participation and your energetic questions today as well. I wish you a good evening. I'm Brian Maguire.